Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to do something a little unusual. We're drifting back to the Victorian era. It's late evening. You've brushed your teeth. Maybe you've dimmed the lights. Maybe you're tucked into bed. And now you're about to hear why the so-called age of refinement was less comfortable than a hay bale with splinters. If you ever imagined that living in Victorian times would be charming, with lace curtains and little teacups and quiet strolls through Hyde Park, well, let's just say you might not last a day. And we're not starting with grimy streets or coal dust. We're starting with beauty rules. Because if you were alive in 1850, looking acceptable in society was practically a full-time job. And naturally, every single rule about appearance made your life just a little bit worse. Let's settle in and wander back slowly. Picture yourself waking up in a London townhouse around 1860. The air is chilly, because of course it is. There's no central heating, only a small fireplace that's gone out overnight. You're lying under heavy wool blankets, hair flattened, face puffy from sleeping upright, because lying down too flat was said cause wrinkles. You slide out of bed and immediately step onto a cold floor, because no one invented slippers for another few decades. Your first thought, you should probably wash your face. Except, here comes the first problem. In Victorian society, full bathing was not something most people did every day. Water had to be fetched heated, poured into a tub, then drained again, all before breakfast. So, unless you were wealthy enough to have servants do it for you, and even if you were, you probably just did what they called a sponge bath, which sounds efficient but was mostly just dabbing your face and neck with a slightly soapy cloth. Naturally, this was supposed to make you feel fresh, but what it really did was leave you feeling vaguely damp and a little sticky for the rest of the morning. And heaven help you if you were wearing the 20 layers of undergarments that respectable Victorian women were expected to wear. Ah yes, the clothing. Let's drift into the dressing room, because this is where the real ordeal begins. First comes the chemise, a long plain shift worn closest to skin. Then comes the corset, which is laced tightly, not so much that you can't breathe, but enough that sitting down becomes a complicated decision. The goal was to achieve a waist that could theoretically be spanned by two hands. Not your hands, mind you, just anyone's hands. Small waist, good marriage prospects. That was the logic. The corset wasn't even the worst part. On top of that, you had the petticoats. Several of them. Stiff horsehair crinolines. Maybe a steel hoop cage if you were fashionable. Then an underskirt, an overskirt, and finally the dress itself, which would weigh 10 pounds if made of proper silk. Walking in this was like navigating an obstacle course designed by someone who hated you personally. And yet, this was considered ladylike. Men had their own set of problems, of course. Trousers had to be perfectly creased. Collars starched so stiff they could cut your neck if you turned too quickly. And facial hair was an art form. You couldn't just have a beard. You had to have the right kind of beard. The Maton chop sideburn was popular, which made every man look like he just wandered off the set of a barbershop quartet. And then there were the beauty products. If you think today's skincare aisle is overwhelming, wait until you hear what Victorians were putting on their faces. Face powder was often made with lead. Yes, that lead, the one that causes neurological problems. Rouges were made from mercury. Hair dyes were brewed with silver nitrate that slowly turned hair purple-black, but also stained your scalp an attractive shade of grayish-green. And if you think this sounds like a bad idea, you're right. But in Victorian society, looking pale and delicate was a mark of status. Naturally, this led to fainting. Fainting couches weren't just a design fad. Women were literally passing out from a combination of tight corsets, poor ventilation, and arsenic-laced face powder. But the fainting was also considered elegant. The idea was that if you were so delicate that you occasionally swooned, you must be a very refined person indeed. And here's where we pause for a moment and imagine, would you have made it through even the first hour of this routine? The corset, the powdered face, the hair arranged into a complex structure supported by hairpieces and pins? Tell me in the comments if you think you could survive a day of being laced and powdered before breakfast. Let's move along, because we haven't even left the house yet. Breakfast in the Victorian era was often heavy. Porridge, eggs, bacon, toast. But you had to eat it carefully, because greasy fingers or crumbs on your gown were social death. Napkins were used constantly. Posture was never allowed to slump, and conversation was kept at a very gentle volume, especially if there were visitors. After breakfast came social calls. A respectable lady was expected to leave calling cards at the homes of acquaintances, even if she barely knew them. This meant more walking in a heavy gown, more carefully managed posture, and yes, more exposure to London air, which was famously thick with soot and fog. If you ever try to keep a white dress clean near a coal fire, imagine doing it on a city street, while carriage wheels splash mud on your hem. And if you were from the upper classes, you couldn't just wash the mud off yourself. Servants were there for that. But you were expected to be patient while it dried, which meant sitting for hours in damp skirts. Now, here's a little detail I always find grimly funny. Deodorant, as we know it, didn't exist yet. People used things like alum powder or vinegar rinses to control odor. If those failed, the solution was simple: wear more perfume. By late afternoon, a drawing room full of guests smelled like lavender, rose water, and just a hint of damp wool. And yet, everyone pretended this was normal. Evening brought its own set of challenges. Dinner parties could last 3 hours or more, with multiple courses and strict etiquette. Knives and forks had to be held just so. Elbows never left the table. Conversation remained light. If you accidentally said something too serious, heaven forbid something political, you risked killing the mood entirely. And then, just when you thought you were done, came the beauty routine all over again. Face washed with rose water. Hair brushed exactly 100 strokes to keep it glossy. Corset unfastened. Chemise changed. Nightcap on. Prayer said. And then you went to bed ready to do it all again the next morning. Would you have made it through? Or would you have torn off the corset and gone to live in a cottage by noon? I'd love to hear your answer in the comments, mostly because I suspect many of you would last about as long as I would, which is not very. Let's drift gently onward into the part no one likes to talk about: hygiene. The Victorians, to put it politely, had a complicated relationship with cleanliness. This was a century of public bathhouses, harsh soaps, and tooth powders that sometimes worked better as sandpaper than as dental care. Imagine waking up on a summer morning and deciding it's a bathing day. You send word to the servants, who trudge down to fetch water from the kitchen pump, heat it over the stove, and haul it up to the bedroom. By the time the bath is ready, half the morning has passed. You undress, step in, and do your best to feel refreshed, in water that's already cooling because there's no way to reheat it halfway through. And then comes the strangest part. That same bath water was often used for several members of the household, one after another, in order of social rank. So if you were the youngest daughter, by the time it was your turn, the water looked more like weak tea. Daily showers, of course, were not a thing yet, even among the wealthy. Full bathing happened perhaps once a week. Everyone else relied on sponge baths, vinegar rinses, or perfumes to keep themselves socially tolerable. Teeth were another adventure entirely. Toothbrushes existed, boar bristle heads on bone handles, but they were expensive, and the powders used with them were often abrasive enough to wear away enamel. Ingredients can include brick dust, crushed seashells, and chalk. So yes, your teeth might look whiter, but they were also steadily eroding. And if you had bad breath, well, there were breath mints, made from herbs like cloves and peppermint, but the real solution was to simply avoid breathing too close to anyone. Hair care was its own ordeal. Shampoo as we know it didn't exist. People used soaps or egg washes, followed by vinegar rinses, then brushed the hair until it shone. And because the style was to have glossy, heavy hair, many women collected the hair that fell out in their brushes and used it to create hair rats, little pads that were tucked under the real hair to create fashionable volume. Imagine saving your shed hair in a jar for months and then sewing it into a little cushion. But it was practical, and Victorians were nothing if not practical. Men had their own share of rituals. The beard needed trimming, oiling, waxing into a proper shape. Mustaches were curled at the ends with little metal tongs heated in the fire, a process that, if done too hastily, could result in singed whiskers and a smell that lingered for hours. And still, after all this, London was not a particularly clean place. The streets were filled with horses, and where there are horses, there is, well, horse output. Carriages splashed filth on passing pedestrians, drains overflowed, and the Thames itself was an open sewer until the great stink of 1858 forced Parliament to act. I sometimes wonder, would you even step outside knowing what might splash onto your skirt? Or would you stay indoors with the windows closed and risk fainting from the smell of your own perfume? Let me know in the comments. And let's wander onward to the next ordeal, because now we get to talk about fashion. Ah, yes, Victorian fashion, a triumph of engineering over common sense. If you survived the morning sponge bath and the hair arrangements, you were rewarded with a dressing process that took half the household to accomplish. The corsets have been unfairly maligned at times. Yes, some women did tight lace to achieve waists of 18 inches, but most corsets were simply supportive undergarments. Still, they were stiff and restricting, and they encouraged a posture so upright that sitting down felt like negotiating a treaty. Then came the crinoline. At first, it was a simple petticoat stiffened with horsehair, but soon it evolved into a cage made of steel hoops that could reach several feet in diameter. This was fashionable. The wider, the better. Walking through doorways required turning sideways. Sitting in a carriage meant either folding the crinoline upward like a taco shell or booking the entire seat for yourself. And crinolines were not just inconvenient. They were dangerous. The hoops could catch fire if a lady stood too close to the hearth. There are actual reports of skirts bursting into flames, which, needless to say, ruined the evening. Then came the bustle, which arrived in the later part of the century. This was a padded structure worn under the skirt to create the fashionable back-heavy silhouette, giving the impression that you were permanently on the verge of sitting down. Combined with the corset and the high collar, it created a look that was both elegant and faintly ridiculous. Men's fashion was hardly easier. Starched collars were so stiff they sometimes caused fainting. Frock coats had to be brushed and pressed daily. Hats were non-negotiable. A gentleman never went outside without one. And removing it at the wrong time could be a social blunder. What would you have done? Embraced the hoops and bustles, or declared yourself a fashion rebel and worn simple linen? I suspect many of you would have opted for the rebel route. But let's drift forward to see what happened once you were actually dressed and ready to face society. Now that you're washed, brushed, dressed, and corseted into immobility, it's time to face the most treacherous part of Victorian life, society. Everything was a performance. You didn't just visit someone, you paid a call, and you had to leave your calling card on a silver tray in their front hall. The design of your calling card mattered. Too ornate, and you looked vulgar. Too plain, and you looked unimportant. You could only call on someone at certain hours, typically late afternoon. And if they weren't home, you left your card folded in a particular way to indicate whether you had come personally or sent a servant. And once you were actually admitted into the drawing room, the real dance began. Conversation was light, pleasant, and carefully choreographed. You did not talk about politics. You did not talk about money. You did not talk about anything that might cause discomfort. Weather, travel, music, literature, those were safe topics. But say the wrong thing or stay too long, and you could be quietly dropped from the social calendar. Your name might simply stop appearing on invitation lists. Social death could come swiftly and silently. Then there were the dinner parties. These could last for hours and required both physical endurance and conversational skill. The meal might have 10 or 12 courses, each served with a different wine. And you were expected to keep up cheerful chatter between bites, never betraying that your corset was slowly crushing your ribs. After dinner came the drawing room separation. Men went to smoke and drink port, women to sit with coffee and embroidery. Then the two groups reunited for music or cards, before finally departing late into the night. Would you have thrived in this environment? Or would you have dreaded the knock of the footman delivering yet another invitation? Let me know in the comments. And let's step gently into the next part of the story, where we explore what it was like to be a child in this world of rules. Victorian children lived under an iron framework of discipline and duty. If you were a child of the upper classes, you were raised not by your parents but by a nurse or governess. Mother might visit you once a day for a brief kiss on the forehead, but most of your time was spent in the nursery. The day began early, washing, dressing, lessons in reading, writing, French, and drawing. Meals were plain, porridge for breakfast, bread, and milk for tea. Then came more lessons, music practice, penmanship, geography recitations. Children were taught to sit still, speak when spoken to, and keep their hands neatly folded. Play was allowed, but it was supervised and orderly. The rocking horse, the hoop and stick, the doll's house, these were considered safe amusements. Rough play was discouraged, and punishments could be severe. A child who misbehaved might be sent to bed without supper or made to stand in the corner for hours. Boys might receive a caning. Girls might have privileges withdrawn. Even toys reflected the seriousness of the age. Many were designed to teach moral lessons. Dolls came with miniature Bibles. Board games had names like The Road to Virtue or The Mansion of Bliss. Would you have been a quiet, obedient child in this world? Or would you have been the one forever climbing the curtains and exasperating the governess? Tell me in the comments. I suspect we'd have some free spirits among us. Victorian medicine was a strange mixture of progress and peril. This was the age of anesthesia and antiseptics, but also of arsenic wafers sold as beauty aids. Women swallowed small doses of poison to whiten their skin, risking hair loss and stomach trouble in the process. Face creams were made with lead, mercury, or ammonia. Rouges were tinted with carmine from crushed insects. Even soaps could contain harsh chemicals that left the skin raw. And when illness struck, the remedies were often worse than the disease. Bloodletting, purgatives, blistering, all were still in use. Patent medicines promised to cure everything from gout to melancholy, but many contained opium, alcohol, or cocaine. Children were given soothing syrups laced with morphine to keep them quiet. Cough mixtures might contain chloroform. Laudanum was sold over the counter. Would you have trusted these remedies, or avoided them and risked a longer illness? Romance in the Victorian era was a carefully supervised process. Young ladies were always chaperoned in public. They could not meet a gentleman unaccompanied, could not write to him directly, and could not be seen walking with him unless engaged. The exchange of calling cards was the first step toward acquaintance. Then came the formal visits, the supervised teas, the family dinners. Only after many months of this could a gentleman ask for permission to propose. Weddings themselves were elaborate but restrained affairs. The white wedding dress became fashionable after Queen Victoria wore one in 1840. Afterward came the wedding breakfast, the receiving of guests, and finally the departure for the honeymoon. Divorce was rare and scandalous. A woman who left her husband risked losing custody of her children and being cut off from society. Would you have survived the waiting, the supervision, the endless rules of courtship? Or would you have been tempted to elope? A Victorian household was a machine of schedules. Breakfast at 8, luncheon at 1, tea at 4, dinner at 8. Bells rang to summon servants to bring coal, light lamps, or carry messages. Meals were elaborate. Soup, fish, joint game, pudding, cheese. Everything was served in order, with proper silver and china. The mistress of the house had to keep the accounts, plan menus, supervise the staff, write endless letters. Her mornings were consumed with household management, her afternoons with social visits, her evenings with entertaining. It was a life that left little time for rest, though there was always time for tea. Travel was an adventure. The railway had transformed Britain, but it was still a noisy, smoky experience. Ladies carried special dust cloaks and veils to keep the soot off their clothes. Carriages were the main mode of local transport, but they were expensive to maintain. Streets were crowded, muddy, and full of manure. Crossing sweepers were employed to clear a path for pedestrians. And then there was a seaside holiday, a chance to escape the smoke of London and take the sea air. Bathing machines allowed ladies to enter the water without being seen, rolling them into the waves like little huts on wheels. The Victorians adored gossip. Queen Victoria herself was a figure of fascination, from her passionate marriage to Prince Albert to her long years of mourning after his death. The court was filled with intrigues, affairs, secret marriages, dramatic feuds between ladies in waiting. Society pages reported on who had worn what, who had fainted at which ball, who had been seen driving too fast through Hyde Park. Would you have loved to read the gossip columns? Or would you have been the subject of them? Death was a constant companion in the Victorian age, and mourning was a full-time occupation. Widows wore black for months or even years. Mourning jewelry contained locks of hair from the deceased. Post-mortem photographs were taken as keepsakes. Even the house went into mourning. Mirrors were covered, curtains drawn, clock stopped. Queen Victoria herself wore black for 40 years after Albert's death, setting a national example. Would you have been comforted by these rituals or weighed down by them? And now we have walked together through every stage of Victorian life, from birth to courtship, from fashion to funerals. Take a moment to breathe. Let yourself be grateful for the little mercies of modern life. Hot water from a tap, comfortable clothes, medicine that works. If you enjoyed this long, slow journey into the past, please give this video a like, share it with a friend who loves history, and subscribe so you don't miss our next bedtime adventure. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments, would you have survived the Victorian era?